Regis Legal LLP, Mr. Ish Jain. He's also the emergency arbitrator at Prime Disputes UK. Sir, we are honored to have you on board, and it is our pleasure to hear from you. And it is our pleasure and honor that you took out your precious time to join us. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir.
Always a pleasure, Kumar.
So, sir, the format of the webinar will be as follows. First, we'll be having an introductory remark of 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll be moving forward with the subtopics of the main topic. And then with the concluding remarks, we'll be moving forward with the Q&A session from the audience as well. So I hope it is clear, sir.
Yes, sounds good.
Thank you, sir. So shall we start?
Yes.
Bhavya. So today with me, Bhavya Gupta will be moderating the session. And Bhavya, shall we start with the presentation?
Yes, I am stuck.
Bhavya, if you can move to the next slide.
Yes, sir.
So before we look at the amendment, it's necessary to understand of the changes in the Indian arbitration law, which has happened over the years. The first arbitration law, which was formulated, was done by the British rule. The Arbitration Protocol and Convention Act of 1937 and the Indian Arbitration Act of 1940. These were basically gifts of the imperial rule. It is not designed to suit the Indian mindset or the culture of resolving disputes in India. The intent of these arbitration laws was to keep India in compliance with statutes in the England at that time. It was primarily intended to suit the needs and purpose of the British government more than the needs of the Indian people. After the Britishers left, no one bothered to change the position, since arbitration was not a culture which was even considered back then. And even then, in 1937, arbitration was not accepted as a culture even by the Britishers. Therefore, there were shortcomings even in the 1940 Act. For instance, there were several points of interference of the court even during the course of arbitration proceedings. And even post the award, there were large number of grounds to challenge the award. So, there were a lot of shortcomings even in the 1940s. And then came the New York Convention. Now, one would presume that, the Foreign Awards Recognition and Enforcement Act of 1961 was India's acceptance of arbitration. But that was not so. India merely took provisions from the New York Convention. If you see the language of the Foreign Awards Act of 1961 and the New York Convention, they're very similar to each other. So it appears that there was no mind application. There was no thought behind making it a pro arbitration position in India. Obviously, today we are going to look at the domestic laws, domestic arbitrations. So I will not really touch upon of how this would impact on the international arbitration. So we'll not cover the second part of the Indian Arbitration Act as it stands today. Then came the 1996 Arbitration Act. This happened because of liberalization in India in 1991. One can say that this is a primary triggering finger for the 1996 Act. In India, there was already a change which was taking place because of liberalization, and foreign investments and foreign funds started to flow into India. So the mindset really required to change. But even the 1996 Act, when the legislation was created, it was more of a pro-court approach rather than the pro-arbitration approach. So the intent was to make it simpler and easier to meet the international standards. We simply implemented the ancestral model law with some modifications, and we implemented the 1996 Act. This difference in approach has resulted that foreign arbitration still continue to be preferred seats as London, Paris, Singapore, New York, Switzerland. India was never the first preference for arbitration, even when the agreements were executed in India. This was a consequence of the pro-court approach, where several procedural hurdles even survived in the 1996 Act. And unless that changed, nothing was going to really happen. And then came the 2015 amendment. Obviously, we'll deal more of that in detail once we go to the next slide. But even in the 2015 amendment, there were certain hurdles which continue to remain. One thing that we need to note over here is when the amendment of 2015 came in, that is the first time that the legislature changed its approach from pro-court approach to pro-arbitration approach. So there were three simple objectives of the 2015 amendment. There has to be a time efficient method, there has to be removal of inordinate delays, and there has to be a removal of procedural hurdles. Now, if you see, these are things which are differently worded, and there are different provisions trying to implement these three objectives. But the essence of all these three things revolves around time, because one thing we need to understand, the difference between the court and the arbitration is time. Time is the essence of arbitration. If we remove time as a factor, there is no difference between arbitration and the court proceedings. So if you see, all the objectives and all the amendments have revolved around how to make arbitration more time efficient. Obviously, the 2015 amendment was as a result of the 246th Law Commission report. Just a second. 246 Law Commission report. Some changes were incorporated from the Commission report. Some changes were incorporated with variance, and some changes were is not even incorporated even today. For instance, there was a recommendation for fraud to be made not arbitrable, and that's not even incorporated today. Then came the 2019 amendment. This was post the high-level committee report of under the chairmanship of Justice B.N. Sri Krishnan. The object of the 2019 amendment was to further strengthen and to make arbitration more user-friendly, cost-effective, and time-bound. Again, if we see, the idea of making it user-friendly and time-bound is the same thing. It's differently worded, but the essence still remains time. Another objective of the 2019 amendment was to make India as an international arbitration hub. Slight debate on that, because it's not because of the laws in India that we do not become an international hub for arbitration. It's more to do with the quality of arbitrators that we have in India, which really requires an upgrade. And that, I think, has to do more with educating and providing education in arbitration field and more exposure to foreign arbitrations in India. If we can just move to the next slide. Bhavya? Yeah, thank you. So now we come to what are the recent developments, recent amendments in 2015 and 2019. The idea behind merging these two amendments is both go hand in hand, and you really cannot bifurcate of which amendments are to be prioritized and which not. So what I've done is I've taken both the amendments because both have certain relevant portions and both have some portions which may not really have a lot of consequence as we stand today because of the Supreme Court judgments. So let's start with the first one. This relates to one step forward towards arbitration. Why I say one step forward towards arbitration, we'll come to the next few slides and you will realize of why this is one step forward only and not anything more than that. So in that relation, let's see which is the first one, the point of appointment of arbitrators. Now, Section 11 of the Act, which provides for amendment, which requires serious changes since the interpretation of the existing Section 11 of the 1996 was all over the chart. I mean, there were different interpretations even by Supreme Court. We had judgments of SBB Corporation, we had National Insurance, we had United India case, and there was a lot of uncertainty. For instance, if today when you write a contract, as the draftsman of the contract, you would interpret that the Supreme Court provided for one particular law. And by the time the parties over the years implemented, there was another judgment which provided a contrary view. So that uncertainty continued to remain. So Section 11 actually provided for a lot of amendments. And one of the first amendment which came as a welcome was the disclosures. So the arbitrators are now required to give written disclosures for their direct, indirect interests, whether financial, business, professional, or any other kind, which may give rise to justifiable doubts as to their independence or impartiality, or probably their availability to devote time to complete the arbitration within 12 months. These parameters are already provided in the fifth schedule for potential conflict of interest. The schedule is actually very similar to the international standards of how the conflict of interest has to be managed when arbitrations are conducted. The format also has been provided under the sixth schedule of the 1996 Act now. Then comes the eighth schedule. This provided for the basic ingredients for appointment. It provides 9 categories of persons who can be appointed as an arbitrator. So it's not just advocates. It includes chartered accountants as well, and there are a lot of several technical people who can now be appointed as an arbitrator. Obviously, there was no bar earlier, but having a schedule set that out provides a good structure of how this can move forward and include other professions as well. It provides for the necessary qualifications of these people. It provides for necessary experience of these people. It provides for certain soft skills. For instance, fairness, integrity, impartiality. The arbitrator should operate without conflict of interest, etc. So it provides a wholesome package of how and who can be an arbitrator. Then comes the issue of deletion of section 11.6a. I mean, this is there was an introduction of the 11.6a under the 2015 amendment, and then subsequently deleted in 2019. My personal opinion has been that courts are required to see whether there exists an arbitration agreement or not. Beyond that, the questions of arbitrability of the disputes ought to rest with the arbitrator, because it is the court can only take a prima facie view when you file a section 11 application for appointment of arbitrator. But the arbitrator will be able to take a more informed decision, in the sense after giving a detailed hearing, after considering the actual statement of claim and the defense which has been raised by the respondent, and determine whether the dispute is arbitrable or not. When we go in section 11 for appointment of an arbitrator, it's a prima facie view before the court. So that's obviously my personal opinion, but we'll see of how this develops over the time. Another important thing which now came in relation to the appointment of arbitrators has been the recognition of arbitral institutions. If you just Google it, there will be several institutions that you will see are spread across India. But these institutions have never been recognized by the Act. In fact, the Mumbai Arbitration Center, MCIA, was one of the first to be appointed as an arbitration institution under an application for Section 11. So that's a welcome move by the amendments. And in fact, these institutions have been given a period of 30 days to make the appointment of arbitrator once there is a direction from the High Court or the Supreme Court. So that's to do with the amendments. Next, that's to do with the appointment of arbitrators. The next amendment, which I feel has significance in practical use, is the amendment of Section 9 and Section 17, which revolves around the interim reliefs in arbitration. This is a little tricky because the 2015 amendment, obviously, let me just show you what the 2015 amendment is. Prior to 2015, Section 9 was wide enough to cover everything practically, and all the applications for interim relief before or during the arbitral proceedings were in Section 9, which were lying before the court. This not only increased the burden of the courts, but frustrated the object of, time is the essence, because by the time the Section 9 would reach its finality, the arbitration would be completed, in essence defeating the purpose of Section 9. So now what the 2015 amendment has done is strengthen Section 17, which allows the arbitrator to grant interim reliefs, and has reduced the burden of the courts, because under Section 17, the arbitrator is given similar powers to the court of passing interim awards and enforcing them. Obviously, the wordings used under Section 17 in the 2015 amendments were a little wider because it provided for the arbitrator to pass interim reliefs even post the award. That's where the 2019 amendment, clarified. Uh, if an award has been passed, the arbitrator basically becomes functus officio, except for, the exceptions in Section 33 of the Act. There is nothing that the arbitrator can really do in terms of the arbitration proceedings. Therefore, the 2019 amendment then clarified that it actually deleted the words "or at any time after making of the award," but before it is enforced. This is the sentence which has been deleted, which now again gives the burden on the court that after the award is passed, any interim reliefs to be sought by the parties have to be to the court, and that's how we stand today under the interim reliefs. Obviously, not the most ideal position, but that's I don't see a way around this. The next amendment would be time is the essence of arbitration. As I mentioned earlier, time is the absolute essence, and there are several provisions in the arbitration amendment which provide for the time is the essence. In fact, the earlier one which we have discussed about the appointment of the arbitration, about the arbitral institutions, about providing whether what the court should consider in a Section 11 application, whether the court should deal with Section 9 or Section 17. All these are in relation to time again. Now, in this category, in terms of appointment, we have already covered that the application under Section 11 has to be disposed of within 60 days from the date of service of notice on the opposite party. Obviously, this time is further reduced when the appointment is to be done by the arbitral institutions. It is reduced to 30 days. In terms of the procedure, the 2015 amendment under Section 229A, it provided the time limit for 12 months for passing of the final award. Now, this time would start counting from the day on which the arbitral tribunal is constituted. And obviously, there is a provision for another 6 months extension by the consent of the parties. And then if further 6 months are to be extended, you would have to approach the court. There is a flip side to this, which we'll discuss at the end of the webinar. But the 2019 amendment of Section 29A changed the date on which this period of 12 plus 6 months starts. So what it has done is under Section 23, it provides the time limit of 6 months to complete the pleadings. That is, in essence, to file the statement of defense, a party respondent has been given 6 months period. And the period of 18 months, that is 12 plus 6, would now begin from the date on which the pleadings are completed as per Section 23. So what has happened is that now, instead of reducing the period, we have extended the period. Now, while all this happens, what is not realized is that there are certain cases in which there is a complexity of disputes, and this complexity of disputes sometimes require a longer period. But to lay down as a general rule is something that I don't agree with. Anyways. Moving forward, Section 29A then also provided for another clarification. It provided that whilst the application for extension of time was pending before the court, the mandate of the arbitrator would still continue until the disposal of the application. This has been a welcome change because prior to 2019 amendment, there were applications under Section 29A for extension of time which would remain pending. And there was a difference in practice followed by the arbitrators. Some would proceed and some would stay the arbitration proceedings till the Section 29 application was not disposed of. This caused a lot of delay because sometimes the courts would be burdened with so many applications that it would not be able to dispose of within the required time. And one thing which this Section 29A has not considered is the time required to file rejoinders. Now, you may note over here very carefully that when we talk about completing the pleadings, as per the Act, the pleading stands completed when you file the statement of defense. it does not deal with rejoinders, if there is no counterclaim, or it does not deal with rejoinder to the counterclaim. It's just statement of defense. And the period of 12 months starts on the day on which the statement of defense has been filed. So there is no recognition of rejoinder as yet, though in practice, a lot of arbitrators do allow filing of the rejoinder. The next amendment, which has been a welcome change, has been Section 29B, the fast track approach. The fast track approach, the parties to an arbitration may, before or after the Constitution, agree in writing to adopt a fast track approach to dispose of the proceedings. Such disputes will be decided ordinarily based on written pleadings, admitted documents, and written submissions. Generally, in these kind of cases, there is no cross-examination, there is no oral hearings, there is no lengthy procedure for evidence filing. And this ordinarily results in the award being reached in 6 months or less than 6 months. Now, what happens when the award is passed in less than 6 months? It provides that the arbitral tribunal shall be entitled to such additional fee as may be agreed by the parties if the award is made before the expiry of 6 months from the date of constitution of the tribunal. And at the same time, the court has also, in order to make sure that the arbitrator does not delay, has provided that if the arbitral tribunal is the reason because of which the proceedings are delayed, there is a provision to now provide for reduction of fees of the arbitrator if the delay is attributable to the arbitrator or the tribunal. So there are both sides. I mean, if you finish early, you have an advantage. If you finish late, obviously there is a reduction in the arbitrator's fee. The next change has been something which was existing even before the amendment under Section 75. But that has to do more with the international arbitration, and that is confidentiality. Now under Section 42A, the arbitrator, the arbitral institution, and the parties to the arbitration agreement will have to maintain confidentiality of all arbitration proceedings except the award. And to the extent, when we discuss about the award, it is to the extent its disclosure is necessary for implementation and enforcement of the award. We may realize many times parties choose arbitration because of the essence of the arbitration. One of the essence of the arbitration also being confidentiality. It is never expressly stated before in India in terms of domestic arbitrations, but the 2019 amendment now makes it obvious that confidentiality is also one of the essence of arbitration. And the idea to insert it in as a part of the act is to instill confidence in the parties to adopt arbitration rather than take a chance in the open court hearings. So when confidentiality is important, the parties have known to choose arbitration even if it originally did not form a part of their contract. The next amendment is in relation to Section 24. This Section 24 amendment, on the face of it, looks pretty simple, but sometimes if it is implemented correctly, it goes to the essence of arbitration, which is once again time, the primary essence of arbitration. And if it is implemented and recognized correctly, it has far-reaching effects on completion of the arbitration proceedings. What Section 24 in effect provides that oral hearings can take place on day-to-day basis before the tribunal. And if adjournments are required, it is not to be granted unless there is sufficient cause shown before the tribunal. In fact, the powers are also given to the tribunal to impose costs on parties seeking adjournments without valid reason. Unfortunately, in practice, rarely we have seen that the arbitrators take such steps because there is always a fear that the allegations may be made that the arbitrator is biased, or because of the underlying urge to follow due process of law, or the concept of last opportunity. I mean, this due process of law and last opportunity somehow is hardwired into us in practice. So Section 24 today is not in true essence implemented. Obviously, there is good basis, but a lot can be achieved if it is implemented. Obviously, Section 31 is the next amendment, if you can see. And the section 31, interest and cost are the two things which have now been added. There are a lot of judgments which gave different views, but it is good to have a section which clarifies the legal position and gives certainty. Section 31, the first aspect is interest. The amended provision provides that the amount to be paid in the arbitral award shall carry an interest of 2% higher than the rate of the current rate of interest prevalent on the date of the award, and such interest is payable till the awarded sum is not is paid actually to the award holder. The current rate of interest shall have the same meaning as provided in the Interest Act. Another addition apart from the interest, this is not in place, but in addition to the interest is cost. Now, obviously, when we go for a civil litigation in the court, there is a concept of cost which is available, but we have rarely seen that the costs have been awarded in the past. But if certain judgments are seen, certain recent judgments on cost are seen, these judgments have come post the amendment of 2015. So once the concept of cost was introduced in the arbitration, even the courts in ordinary litigations have started imposing exemplary costs or litigation costs at the end of the proceedings. A decree does include the aspect of cost. Obviously, the cost will include the arbitrator's fee, the venue charges, the cost incurred for the lawyers, and it is normally awarded to the successful party, and the burden is to be borne by the unsuccessful party. In one of my own personal arbitration case, I had awarded 22 lakhs as cost to an unsuccessful party, and this cost was then upheld by the Bombay High Court. So it is not unheard of, and it is not as if in arbitration the cost is not as a matter of practice. This concept is also ideal because the litigant who obstructs and delays the arbitration process is likely to pay more cost. This acts as a deterrent to such litigants, So cost is a welcome change in our arbitration. The next is on section 34. Now, some major ambiguity was covered by the amendment. The arbitral tribunal can be used under section 34 for taking recourse for setting aside of an arbitral award. It basically replaces the word furnishes proof. Under section 34, before the amendment, it provided that a party who wanted to challenge the award had to furnish proof of certain things. That concept has now changed because there was a series of litigations where challenges were made to the award, where the parties would come with material which were not placed before the tribunal, and this practically led to the courts then indulging themselves into evidence which is not before the tribunal, then setting aside the award, asking the tribunal to reconsider. This would defeat the purpose of the arbitration and would delay the proceedings. Therefore, now what has happened is that the furnish proof of has been deleted and the new words have been added, establishes on the basis of the record of the arbitral tribunal. In essence, it means that when a challenge is made to the award, no other material will be considered except for the material which is already before the arbitral tribunal. This has saved a lot of time and energy for the courts. It has reduced a huge burden for the cost because the courts have now been able to dispose of challenges to the award in a more simpler and quicker way. The next amendment is about section 36. Obviously, there has been a huge row about this, but I will simply just cover over here that, under section 36, the awards are now enforced just like any other decree. Obviously, this was post the 2015 amendment. Before 2015, the amendments provided for an automatic stay on the execution of the award, meaning that once you challenge the award, there is to automatically operate as a stay on the award. And now that has been removed from 2015 onwards. Hence, if an award is now challenged, the applicant needs to now make a separate application for stay and justify why the award needs to be stayed, why the execution needs to be stayed. And if stay is not granted, the execution would proceed just like a decree of the court. Another welcome change for arbitrators, and this was necessary as well, since the number of arbitrations are now growing rapidly. Of arbitrators, which has now been introduced in the 2019 amendment. The amendment brought a safety net for arbitrators by clarifying that no suit or no other legal proceeding shall lie against an arbitrator for anything done in good faith or intended to be done under the Act. This provision is now in line with the international practice. In Singapore, the arbitrators are not held liable for negligence in capacity of an arbitrator, even if it means a mistake in law, mistake in fact, or mistake in procedure in course of the arbitration proceedings, or even if it's the mistake is in making of the final award. So this is again a welcome change. These are some of the important amendments which I find necessary in practical terms. There are other two amendments now. If you can just change the slide, Bhavya, we can go to the next slide. Now these are debatable amendments. Why I say debatable? Because they have been debated. The first one, obviously, the prospective effect of 2015 amendment has been debated. Today, obviously, we feel that it is settled by the Hindustan Construction Company judgment, but we don't know how this may further play out in the coming years. Therefore, I have put that in the category of debatable amendments. The next amendment is establishment of the Arbitration Council of India under section 43A and 43M to 43M. I don't want to really divulge myself into these debatable amendments, but I'll just cover it briefly because these both will require a detailed webinar. I mean, in fact, each of these topics would require at least half an hour because these judgments go quite in depth. But just to briefly touch up and give you an idea of what this prospective effect of the 2015 amendment is. The 2015 amendment provided that this had to be a prospective amendment. This is in special light of the section 36 that we saw, the enforcement of awards, and the provision which provided for the automatic stay, which was removed by the 2015 amendment. A debate arose as to whether this would be applicable to all the present challenges to the award, which are already lying in the court, or would this be applicable to challenges which are filed only after 23rd October 2015, or would it be applicable only to those arbitration proceedings which were initiated after 23rd October 2015? 23rd October 2015 being the date on which the 2015 amendment was implemented. Now, the Kochi cricket judgment therefore laid the foundation as to how this section 36 has to be interpreted. Ordinarily, it provided that it would have a prospective effect, but in this Kochi cricket judgment, BCCI versus Kochi, it was held that the amendment of 2015 to section 36 was retrospective in nature, meaning thereby that all pending applications where awards had been challenged and were automatically subsisted, and therefore the award debtor would now have to apply for stay again. This led to a flood, obviously, of precipice being moved to mention the matter in the court. But that's not the end of the controversy. The Parliament 2019 amendment brought in section 87. The section 87 of the 2019 amendment clarified that the 2015 Act was to apply only to arbitral proceedings which commenced on or after 23rd October 2015, and only to court proceedings arising of or in relation to such arbitral proceedings which started after 23rd October 2015. This basically reversed the decision which was given by the Supreme Court in BCCI versus Kochi Cricket Private Limited. In fact, it did not even have the courtesy to refer to this judgment when it provided for the comments in the amendment. Obviously, there came a time when this section 87 was challenged, and the Hindustan Construction Company judgment by the Honorable Supreme Court on 27th of November 2019 struck down Section 87 as unconstitutional for being arbitrary, and it revived the 2015 amendment, Section 26. And in purpose, it gave the effect that 2015 amendments to all arbitrations, regardless of whether they commenced before or after the 23rd October 2015. So even if there were arbitration proceedings of 2013, 12, 11, which shockingly today are also pending for one reason or the other, but that the 2015 amendments are now applicable because of this judgment. The other controversy again is about the Arbitration Council of India. I will not touch upon right now about the controversy. Let me just give you a brief background of what this Arbitration Council of India is. It's covered under Section 43A to 43M of the Act, and it provides for establishment of an Arbitration Council of India, which will have its headquarters in Delhi. The chairperson will be appointed by the central government. The other members of the council will obviously be the practitioners and eminent people from the academic field in arbitration. The ex officio members of the council will include secretaries of two ministries, that is the Law and Justice Ministry and the Ministry of Finance. The idea behind the Arbitration Council of India, as per these sections, is to promote and encourage arbitration, mediation, conciliations, other methods of dispute resolution. Another object is to frame policies, guidelines for establishment and operations and maintenance of uniform professional standards in respect of all matters relation to arbitration. It also is in charge of framing policies governing the grading of arbitral institutions and arbitrators, and recognize professional institutes providing accreditations to arbitrators. I mean, so let's not go into it, because there are several interpretations to these words which have been used in these sections. But let's move forward to the next slide. Bhavya, if you can please move to the next slide. Yes. So if you recollect, in the beginning of the presentation, I showed you one step forward. Somehow it has been the nature of the legislatures in India of providing one step forward and two step backward. Why I'm saying two step backward will be evident from this slide. So continuing the topic just before this about the Arbitration Council of India, if you can just see the points which I mentioned, the government is involved. Now, the problem associated with this government control over institutionalization process is the possibility of nepotism, red tapeism, lack of objectivity, lack of transparency in grading process. There is no clarity. You are adding government control over arbitrations. I mean, for lack of better example, in this short notice, I could only come up with the example of cryptocurrency. It is as good as saying that the cryptocurrency is to be stored and regulated by the banks. I mean, there is nothing wrong with the banking mechanism, but you can't put cryptocurrency in banks regulation, because then there is no difference in the transaction. I mean, it's still currency which is regulated by the banks. So if you put arbitration under the hands of the government and under the hands of the court, there is not going to be any difference. The idea of being pro arbitration is simply defeated by establishment of the Arbitration Council of India in the manner in which it is presently proposed. The next problem is the accreditation by the council. I mean, this raises several questions of independence and impartiality, because it leaves the discretion in the hands of executive and government body to decide who gets to be a part of this reform. There is no clarity as to on what specific grounds a particular arbitration institution will or will not be graded by the council. What about several arbitration disputes where government or quasi-government institutions are party? Isn't there an apparent conflict of interest? The indirect appointment authority is the party, claimant, or the respondent to the same arbitration proceedings. I mean, there has to be a conflict. How are you going to decide? The person who's appointed as an arbitrator is graded by the government to be of a particular level. I mean, there is a lot of things that can be said about this. What about foreign arbitral institutions? Will they go through those administrative hurdles? I mean, the court will be handicapped if they have to designate institutions which are not graded by the council as yet, and which still has global reputation for providing best quality services, and which wants to simply establish its local office in India. Will such institutions, foreign institutions, go through the administrative hurdles of being graded by the council? It doesn't look like that. What about foreign arbitrations? Another main drawback is it limits party autonomy in international arbitrations through government and court interference. I mean, less of court interference, but more of government interference in this case of the council. In my experience, a foreign party will often prefer to stay away from arbitration regimes where significant degree of government interference is involved, because there is a lot that can be said about how nepotism and nepotism can ruin the entire arbitration mechanism in India. But yeah, this is the Arbitration Council of India is a step backward according to me. Another step backward is the Section 23 amendment that we just discussed. Originally, it provided from the date of constitution of the tribunal 12 months. Now, when we bring in the date of filing of the statement of claim, it's not a fixed point in time. And moreover, pleadings can be amended at different stages. So when exactly does the 12 months period begin for passing of the award? So, this is, I feel, a step backwards, because the original period was good and it was working. I do not see a reason of why an additional 6 months has been added in an undefined point of time between the arbitration proceedings. I feel that this is going to raise several satellite disputes for the courts to settle the interpretation. And also, there is no consequence provided for not filing the statement of defense in 6 months. I mean, so when does the period of 18 months start? I mean, if I don't, 12 months start. If I don't file my statement of defense for 12 months, my first period of passing of the award will start after a period of 12 months from the date on which the arbitration proceedings have already begun. This in effect has led the arbitration period to extend to 2 years instead of 12 months. So a lot of ambiguity is over here. I mean, this I feel is a step backward again. The next is Section 29A. If an award is passed in 6 months, it sounds very impressive. It sounds as if it's an incentive to the arbitrator for finishing the award in 6 months. But the language used is not really intensivizing the arbitrator, because the language used over here is parties will determine. When the option is given to the parties to determine whether an arbitrator is to be paid an extra fee for completing the dispute in 6 months, I do not see who would agree to this. I mean, if I was a party, ordinarily I would never want to shell out more money, because arbitration, by the end of the arbitration, a party has already spent a lot of amount on the arbitration fees, on the venue charges, on other miscellaneous expenses, on the lawyers' fees, on the counsel fees. So I do not see that this particular has any value in real sense. In fact, a better alternative would have been to fix a percentage of increase in the existing fee. For instance, if an arbitrator charges X, you can add X plus 5% or 10% or 15% or 50% for finishing the passing the award in 6 months. At the same time, if you see the next category, Section 29A2, if no award is passed in 18 months, what then? I mean, it seems to be counterproductive and imaginary, considering the backlog of cases that the Indian courts are already facing. Practically, what happens when no award is passed at the end of 18 months, parties are forced to approach the court. And this is only provided for unrequired judicial intervention and it has also increased the burden on the courts, because there have been instances where several arbitration applications have been moved under section 29A for extension and have been pending for 2-3 months, for a mere reason that the courts are burdened with unnecessary litigations. I mean, it's not practically possible for a judge to intervene in every matter and determine whether who has been responsible for this delay. Sometimes the matters are just too complex, or sometimes the circumstances or the amendments or the subsequent events have warranted it. It is difficult for the court to at every instance investigate into this reasons of the delay. There should obviously be a better way. For instance, there can be a penalty on the party obstructing or causing delay, and the act already provides for a mechanism where, if the reasons for the delay are attributable to the arbitrator, there is a reduction in the arbitrator's fee. I'm sure there can be a similar mechanism for the parties involved themselves, because if an arbitrator is responsible for the delay and he has supposed to be penalty, obviously the parties are also then liable to pay penalties. Also, this 29A2 today I feel that should have considered the pandemic position as well, but this is just fanciful thinking, because neither anybody else would have predicted uh, this pandemic to be a cause for delay in arbitration proceedings. If we can just move to the next slide. Yeah. Now, obviously, the slide before we discussed of how it is 2-step backward. When we say 2-step backward, we should always also consider of wishful thinking of what all the court, what all the Arbitration Act should have also covered, or what all the amendments which have been missed by the legislators. Even today, I feel there is a lot which is left to the courts to interpret. And I mean, if the amendments would have clarified some of these points, it would have been better. For instance, nominating a sole arbitrator in agreement. Today, if two people enter into a contract and nominate Bhavya as an arbitrator, the courts are not really obliged to appoint Bhavya always as an arbitrator. Even if he would have qualified the parameters set out in the 8th schedule, and this has been seen in practice. So a clarity of that in the act would have been much better. I mean, we have instances where bank loan agreements provide for a certain name, and that's the most ideal situation, that the person who's been nominated by the bank in the loan agreements or in the agreements which between the banks is generally appointed as an arbitrator, and the matter proceeds. If you have a problem with it, you are supposed to apply to the court for change of arbitrator. I mean, that's I feel is the most desirable approach in this situation. But when there are construction contracts or other private disputes, we have normally seen that the person who's nominated in the contract, if the other side disputes it, a party is normally relegated to approach the court and look for nominating the arbitrator. That I feel is just delaying the proceedings. In fact, the method should change. It should be more where the party opposing the arbitrator should be relegated to the court to challenge the continuation of the arbitration proceedings, or for change of arbitrator, or a similar relief. Another wishful thinking, which obviously I feel should have been incorporated, is consequences of not providing the disclosures or providing incorrect disclosures. There has to be some sort of penalties or some sort of fear for the arbitrators to not give a disclosure. I have seen almost 22 arbitration proceedings where, and especially in terms of banks, when there is a bank involved in the dispute, where the arbitrators have failed to give the disclosure statements. So there has to be some sort of penalties or action against such practice. Another one is transcription of proceedings. This is again out of my personal experience. In one of my arbitration proceedings, a party insisted that the proceedings be recorded, because of the cross-examination and the manner of cross-examination. Now, obviously, when it comes to the courts, the judges, it is a different position for the courts when the court says that arbitration proceedings should the court proceedings should not be recorded, because it is at a higher pedestal. It is the court of justice. It cannot be subjected to recording. But the position slightly changes when it's an arbitrator, because it's in camera. It's just the parties which are involved in the arbitration proceedings. But that clarity should come in the act. That clarity today is missing, and therefore different courts have different interpretations to whether a recording of an arbitration proceeding should be allowed or should not be allowed. Different arbitrators have different perspectives towards it. And that clarity obviously would have been desirable in this amendment. Also, another clarity in this regard would be who would bear the cost in this case of the recording, because obviously it would involve some amount of cost for recording on a daily basis of how the arbitration proceeding is progressing. My personal opinion would have been that there has to be a transcription procedure, there has to be a recording. It gives a lot of confidence to the parties and the arbitrator that a fair procedure has been followed. So that's on the wishful thinking. Another point on the wishful thinking would be probably provisions governing the validity of the arbitration agreement for want of stamp duty. Obviously, there have been the recent judgment of Supreme Court has settled that position, but the act could have been probably clarifying this. So yeah, and the last point is the fraud being arbitrable, clarity on that, because even today, every third or the fourth matter where there is a property dispute involved or documents are involved, these issues have been raised, and there have been several contradictory judgments. The last in line is Avital Post versus HSBC PI Holding. I think that was Justice Nariman's judgment. It just passed around 18th or 19th of August of 2020. So yes, those are the wishful thinkings of further amendments that probably we can hope in the future legislations that may come. So yeah, that's
Right,
about
sir.
it, Bhavya. Over to you.
Right, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for your enriching words and enlightening words. Sir, I have few questions upon the appointment of arbitrator as we discussed. So,
Right.
as per the Park and Eastman judgment by Supreme Court stated that unilateral appointment of arbitrator is not an applicable appointment. Supposedly, sir, any particular award which came uh, and there was that award was particularly given by an unilateral arbitrator, and that arbitrator was unilaterally appointed. So, sir, those particular judgments or those particular awards which were given by those arbitrators will be null and void after this judgment.
See, I mean, it's something that is debatable, because there are two different perspectives to this. One perspective would be that it is against the public policy when one party is opposing it and there is a unilateral appointment. There should not be an award which is binding. Another line of thought, and which is something that I personally believe in, is so far as there is nothing contrary to the procedure that I followed, or to the law that is applicable, or to the evidence that is available on record, whether it is one arbitrator or it's the other arbitrator, the outcome would in effect be the same. So the question of unilateral appointment comes into question when there is evidence of bias, and therefore then you are again relegated back to the same principles for challenge of an award which are existing today. So you will have to then go by 34 and 36 and not really relegate into whether it was a unilateral appointment or whether there was a consensual appointment. And this relates back to the question which I had raised about the banks. The bank loan agreements, if you see where those enforcements are taking place, that has generally been the practice. And in one of the matters where I have argued in the court, that has been the position of the court, that yes, it may have been a unilateral appointment based on the documents and based on the nomination by the bank, and you may have opposed it. But where is the fallacy in, or where is the mistake in law, or where is the mistake in fact over here, that you are allowed to challenge the award? If there is no
No, sir.
mistake in law, or
But
there is no mistake in fact,
right, sir.
it doesn't change anything.
So I would like to add one point, that as every judgment has a retrospective effect. So having a retrospective effect, if we look upon the Parkinson Eastman judgment, so as per that particular judgment, what we can conclude is that the cases which are within the limitation period of the Arbitration Conciliation Act, that yes, in between this period we can challenge those judgments or challenge those awards. So if those awards given by a unilaterally appointed arbitrator, doesn't it make that particular award itself null and void, because it is particularly stated in this judgment that unilateral appointments are not applicable, and as per se it is having the retrospective effect, it also makes that prior awards also null and void, which is in between the limitation period of the Arbitration Conciliation Act 1996.
If it has retrospective effect, if you fall within the period of challenging the award, yes, it will have a retrospective effect. But as I said again, despite the judgment, there have been cases where the courts have been able to distinguish, the high courts have been able to distinguish based on the facts. And a simple question that has been raised practically in the courts have been, if I change the arbitrator, will the outcome be different? That is the test. And once you lay down that test, and if you fail that test, the courts have really not been inclined, unless it's something to really go into. So once a court believes that this test has been failed, that is when they have been following the judgment and saying that yes, the appointment has been null and void. But that has been a very, very rare case so far as I have seen in Bombay and Delhi High Court.
Right, sir. So a very quick question upon this. Sir, as per Schedule 5, Entry 22, one arbitrator cannot be appointed in more than 3 cases. Supposedly, if he is being appointed, and but as per Schedule 7, that if there is a justifiable doubt, and that justifiable doubt is not is ineligible, so we can have that particular arbitrator in itself. So, sir, whether the application under Section 14 can be challenged by the article and by the arbitrator under Section 13 before the court, whether it is maintainable or not, that is a question. I mean,
I'm sorry, I
whether
didn't
that
get you. The arbitrator would challenge or the party would challenge?
sorry,
I didn't get your question. Would the party challenge or the arbitrator would challenge?
the arbitrator would challenge the order.
No, arbitrator would never challenge the order, because I mean, as matter of practice, the arbitrator would not really have any leg to stand upon in the court. An arbitrator either has the choice of proceeding with the matter or not proceeding with the matter, and set out his reasons. Once the arbitrator proceeds, if a party is aggrieved by it, the aggrieving party would then have to approach the court and set out this ground before the court, and in which case the court would then consider. For instance, in a matter in a construction contract, I was back to back appointed in 4 matters where the claimants were the same, but the respondents were different. There were different vendors of that particular claimant, and all those appointments took place on the same day, because they were all listed before the same judge back to back. And obviously, out of those 4 matters, 1 was withdrawn, 2 were settled, and 1 led to an arbitration award. And when that arbitration award was challenged, I had received a notice from the respondent asking me that why haven't I disclosed that there were 4 arbitration proceedings for the same particular claimant. And my simplicity response to him was, I was appointed on the same day, so all 4 disclosure letters were signed on the same day. And when this argument was placed before the court, the courts didn't really mind it, because there was no justifiable reason for the court to interfere. So once again, the test on all these aspects for the court has been, would the outcome change if the arbitrator changed? and so far as the outcome was justifiable, was legal, was sound, the courts have been very reluctant to interpret all these things as an obstruction to arbitration. The approach of the courts have now changed since 2015, and these amendments are the reason for which the approach of the courts have changed, and which is a pleasant welcome.
Surely, sir. Over to you, Bhavya. Do you have any questions for the sir?
Yes, sir. Sir, you said that time is the essence of arbitration. So my question is, will the amendment of 2019, which removes the mandatory timeline for international commercial arbitration seated in India, will it likely to create negative impact on India's perception as an attractive seat for arbitration?
Uh, True, it will create a negative impact because there has already been a lot of debate and a lot of grievance when India is chosen as an arbitration seat. Uh, in fact, the existing timeline, which is extended to start from the date of completion of pleadings, is already something which I'm not happy about. But I think that is not to do with what the courts intended. That is not to do with what the legislature intended, but more to do with the inherent ability of Indian lawyers to find a reason to delay the proceedings. So uh, it's our mindset that we need to change of trying to delay the arbitration proceedings, and therefore cost is important. The section 24 where we as arbitrators impose cost for the delay or obstruction that is caused or not granting of the adjournment is something that has to be specifically enforced and made as a policy even by the courts to encourage. So that's the way for the foreign arbitration proceedings to start in India. Unless that changes in the legislation are not going to really help, expedite the proceedings. It is not going to help bring foreign arbitrations to India. Two things I find always that foreign arbitration have always considered. One is the quality of arbitrators in India, and another is the time that is taken. We as Indians have a different knack of taking adjournments and delaying proceedings. That has to at some stage stop.
Yes, sir. Any further questions, Bhavya? Do you wish to ask us?
No question.
Okay, thank you. I'll give 5 more minutes to participants to if they have any questions or queries for the sir, they can write up in the chat box. Till then, sir, if you wish to give any concluding remarks upon what we have discussed today, a brief of what or any conclusion.
Well, amendments are definitely in the right direction, but we definitely need to get rid of our habit of simultaneously taking 2 steps backward in these certain aspects. That needs to stop at some stage, because on one hand we've taken a tremendous stride in the first step to make it a pro arbitration, but at the same time we've added something that was really not required. I mean, I've still not understood of why Arbitration Council of India has been added when things were already functional in India. I mean, you don't fix something which is not broken as yet. You let it break and then fix it. Today it's not broken. Why have we attempted to fix it in the manner as it is not even required? So we need to really change that habit. And another thing which requires to change is the mindset of practitioners in the legal field. The more we as the younger generations start taking arbitration as more seriously, in the sense of how myself I've implemented the section 24 and imposed the cost of 22 lakhs. It's come as a welcome change. The courts have also upheld it, and so this has to start. At some stage some young practitioners have to do it, and as you students need to start pushing in this direction, start recognizing these things, attending foreign arbitrations, just to seeing of how this transpires around the world. And this is how we can change. The mindset has to change. If you see the difference between the 96 Act and 2015 Act, the difference is the intention of what the legislature wanted. One was pro court and one was pro arbitration. The difference in the mindset changed the entire way the legislation has turned out to be. So that's
Right,
my
sir.
that's my concluding suggestion, remark, or however you can term it.
Surely.
Sir, there is a
Sir,
question.
we have got one question
Yes.
from Mr. Praveen. I believe it's upon the section 34 of the Arbitration Conciliation Act, that how arbitral awards can be set aside. So if you can please,
Arbitral awards generally are set aside when it's basically against public policy, when certain procedures have not been followed, when there is a question which is raised on the independence of the arbitrator. Those are the factors which generally are to be considered. But you know, when you really go to the court, there are things which are considered as, you know, a party is, you know, not in capacity of being represented, or he's not been represented by an advocate, or you know, there are several grounds in 34 which can be taken. But in essence, it has to be the procedure. Obviously, CPC is to be taken under advisement. It is not something which is followed. It is not perverse. It is something which is not against the public policy law in India. It is not against the evidence law which is in India. Though on one hand we say that Evidence Act is not applicable, the CPS is not applicable, but when you construe a challenge to an award, these are the testing grounds, these are the basic rules which are required to be complied. And if the arbitrator or the parties have not followed it, they then become a ground for challenge. And obviously the overlying ground used is against public policy or against you know, the principles of natural justice, but in essence it is against the Evidence Act, it is against the CPC, and for non-compliance of these provisions. Then there are technical grounds in relation to incapacity and, you know, non-submission of the disclosure statements. But as I said, you know, the test again, when the courts look into it, is not on these technicalities. The approach of at least the Bombay and the Delhi High Court has practically changed. I'm not aware of the practice in the other high courts, but the best of my knowledge, these are the primary grounds under 34 where the courts have appreciated the challenge.
right, sir.
Right.
So as we have elapsed our time, so it was really enriching and enlightening hearing from you, sir, about the amendments, and how you gave the analysis of each and every amendment. It is very welcoming, and we really welcome your thoughts and your time. We really thank you for coming on board with us and sharing your precious thoughts, and you're sharing your precious analysis of the amendments. And we hope in future we'll again have some more enlightening sessions like this with you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a
much,
lot.
sir.
Yes.
So let's call it a day, guys. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with another session soon. Thank you.